Hello, it's укрлайф TV, and we continue our broadcasting from Kiev, from Ukraine. And our guest today is Katz. He is a professor of government and politics at George Mason University Schar School of Policy and Government and non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Professor Katz, hello, and thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Professor, in your article, Changing Geopolitical Context of U.S. Support for Human Rights and Democracy Promotion, you make a very interesting analysis between values and interests in American foreign policy. Based on this, how are these interests and values reflected in this big war, Russia's war against Ukraine?
Well, I think that in the case of American support for Ukraine against Russia, this is a case where both interests and values coincide, that it's in America's interest to prevent the expansion of Russia. And it's also, I think, in accordance with American values to support a fellow democracy. So I think that the interests and values, they don't conflict in this case at all.
Let's speak a little bit deeply about the geopolitical aspect of this war, and let's speak about the role of America, let's speak about the role of Russia, let's speak about the role of West in general, and the relationship among them. What do you think? What really is the deep reason for this big war? What's happened in the last years, or maybe during the last decades? Why such big war could be possible in the middle of Europe?
Well, I really think that it all comes down to Vladimir Putin and his mindset, and those are the people who support him. That they, have resented that the breakup of the Soviet Union, which they blame on the West, but it was actually, Boris Yeltsin who signed the agreement with the then communist heads of Belarus and Ukraine to dismantle the Soviet Union. It was an internal project that led to this. And I think that for someone like Vladimir Putin, if this could be voluntarily undone, then it could be voluntarily redone. And I think that as the recent book by Mikhail Zygar indicates, that Putin's understanding of Ukraine is simply, it's a very simplistic understanding that he firmly believes that Ukraine is Russia. Ukrainians are Russians, and that most Ukrainians understand that there's only a few who don't, and that they're therefore fascists or something like this. So he never was willing to understand Ukraine on its own terms and what the aspirations of Ukrainians were. And I think that he focused on the expansion of NATO and not the drawdown of American troops in Europe. To me, that was, it's very clear that, NATO was not threatening Russia, but, he chose to believe this. And so that's where we are. And I think that when he invaded in February 2022, he thought it was going to be all over, in a few days, that, Ukrainians would rise up to join their fellow Russians, and they would all be happy being part of a greater Russia, and then maybe they'd move on to Eastern Europe or something else that they'd be able to. In other words, that I think for Vladimir Putin, his idea was that the West was threatening Russia, but the West was weak, and so. I mean, to me, these are mutually incompatible ideas. If the West is weak, then how does it threaten Russia? If it does threaten Russia, then how is it weak? But he this is what he believed, and so I think here we are, and I think the war, unfortunately, is likely to continue so long as Vladimir Putin is in power. And I think that that's the key, I think, to ending the war, is Vladimir Putin no longer being in power.
Professor, it seems that more and more countries are involved in this war, directly or indirectly. And, it's from our Western partners with their arms supplies to China with its initiatives, from Africa to India. How have these war changed the geopolitical configuration in the world?
Well, certainly, I think it clarified for Western nations that Russia is still a threat, and this is something that people really did not focus on for the longest time. I think that we had the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we had the idea of the end of history. Democracy was spreading everywhere. Well, that didn't happen. But then we had the war on terror, and that's we focused on these few terrorists, that took up so many of America's resources chasing, these few people. And then, of course, there's the rise of China. And so I think that, Russia, to our mind, it seems like, well, Russia is a weakening country. It can't afford to threaten anyone. It wouldn't be logical for Russia to do so. But unfortunately, Russia didn't operate by our logic. And of course, for many West Europeans, that they were buying cheap Russian gas, that it was very inconvenient to think that Russia might be a problem. And so they just didn't do so. And then, of course, Russia demonstrated that it was threatening. And so the West has to, whatever else the West has to worry about, whether it's China or Iran or jihadists or whatever, that Russia is right up there with one of those threats. That's at least, in terms of the lessons of the West. Now, of course, the so-called global South seems to have drawn very different lessons. And I think, to me, what's fascinating is, talking to people from the developing world, is that they know very little about Ukraine. They know very little about Russia, and they don't really want to know all that much about it either. And I think that, they, and also I think that they see it as an opportunity that they can, the West and Russia are at odds. How can we benefit? What can we do to benefit ourselves? And so this has been their attitude, and also just a lot of resentment. Well, why is America supporting Ukraine so much? Why aren't they supporting us, like in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, who they see themselves under threat from Iran? Why isn't the U.S. as concerned about them? And so I think that's a lot of it, that there's a sense that Americans, Europeans are concerned about Europeans, like Ukrainians, not about non-Ukrainians, and that this is, of course, is not fair. And so they're going to just simply not be as supportive, and it's an opportunity for them to show their independence. And of course, as we've seen, a lot of them are buying very cheap Russian oil that they're this is a market opportunity that they see. And and if you point out that this supports Russia, then they'll just point out, well, there are certain European countries that are continuing to buy Russian oil and gas. If you're so concerned about this, why aren't you stopping them from doing so? So it all seems very hypocritical as far as they're concerned. And I think that they just they don't focus on Ukraine, unfortunately, or the plight of the Ukrainians. Or even if they do, it's like, well, what about the war in Yemen, or what about the war in Ethiopia? Why hasn't the West been so concerned about refugees from these countries? So it's sort of it's a mixture of resentment. It's also an attempt to show their independence. But I think that what they're also learning is that, maybe Russia isn't the most reliable, that those who want to buy arms from Russia, well, Russia wants those arms for itself. In fact, I've been reading a report from the Center for Strategic and International Studies that Russia has actually been buying back weapons that it sold to certain countries like India and Myanmar. Just amazing to think that they had to buy these weapons back. So I think that a lot of them. I think that this is sort of a moment when China in particular seems like an increasingly better option to many in the global south than Russia. Maybe more going to turn to India. And I think for a lot of them, they have their own geopolitical sensibility, and it's like let the Westerners, let the Russians fight each other. That we in the global south will benefit, as they do that. And I've heard, people who have met with officials from these various countries, and certainly I've had interactions certainly with an audience once in South Africa, and they really don't. They're just not sympathetic. And I advance the argument that Russia is to Ukraine what Britain and France were to Africa. Colonial powers. Only this is a colonial power that wants to regain its colony. It would be the equivalent of the British and the French tried to regain their colonies in Africa, and they just reject this. No, in other words, colonialism was something that happened that Westerners imposed on non-Westerners. That what Westerners do to one another is not colonialism. Now, my mother is from Ireland. We were ruled by Britain for over 700 years. We feel we know a little bit about colonialism, and people in Finland who, like Ukraine, was also part of the Russian Empire, they know about colonialism. But that's something, in other words, that they just don't want to acknowledge this, because if they do, then to get back to what we talked about originally, that there is a conflict between their values and interests. In other words, if they acknowledge that Russia is a colonial power, as it was, then this would force them to view the matter differently. And they don't want to, therefore they can't, therefore they're not going to. They're going to make excuses for Russia. And this is what they've done, unfortunately.
For a long period, Russia was a strong partner of Western countries, for Europe primarily. But now it seems that the role of Russia changed dramatically. I think so. Maybe you disagree with me. I don't know. But do you think what is the role of Russia today in the modern world, in security system which we have right now in Europe and the world? You laugh.
Well, I don't think it has a role at present. In other words, it's if there were any illusions about Russia being a partner, I think those have been shattered. In other words, that Russia is obviously a rogue actor. It's sort of a giant North Korea, if you will, and that so long as it's under Vladimir Putin's rule, that Russia can't be a partner in any meaningful sense. That I have maybe somewhat naive hopes that there is a better Russia out there. That no nation began as a democracy; it's learned behavior for all nations, and that Russia might be able to learn it too. But we don't see these forces gaining strength in Russia at the present. But it could suddenly happen. I personally sort of harken back to World War I. The Russian army collapsed basically. I suspect that's a possibility in this war as well. That we'll see that the Russian troops at a certain point that they're going to turn on their officers. Maybe that's wishful thinking, but I think that the Russians have been so shocked at Ukrainian resistance. And I think that they simply don't know how to do this, and it was all avoidable. If Russia really didn't want NATO to expand, All Moscow had to do was to treat its neighbors reassuringly. But Vladimir Putin can't do that. He can't treat his own people that way. He can't. How can he treat any of his neighbors that way? So this is their doing, and yeah, unfortunately, I just think that we're not going to see Russia have a meaningful role until there's a change of government. Now, people still think, there are those that, well, China is going to be the big threat, and ultimately we need Russia. So maybe we should make some concessions to Russia on Ukraine, because after all, we're going to need Russia with regard to China. Well, not this Russia. In other words, that Vladimir Putin has made clear that he regards China as his ally. I visited Russia several times, and certainly people there, they're worried about China, and they don't understand why their government isn't. Their government is pretty suspicious of everyone and everything. So why not China? And I suspect that the real reason is that someone like Vladimir Putin, if and when China becomes a threat to Russia, he assumes that it will be a threat to the West, and that Putin, at his own time and choosing, can then pivot to the West, and that the West will support Russia because it will be in the West's interests. In other words, that here's a man who doesn't worry about the difference between interests and values. He only has his own interests, or as he sees them, highly cynical, and that he could bring the West over to his camp if he could just call out, basically, and that they would come running. But I think that Russians are worried that, in the 2030s, that China is not going to be so friendly. And we saw recently, the Chinese government issued a map, and there was some little island there on the border, which Russia and China had divided, and now the Chinese have listed it as being all Chinese. They lost territory to Russia. And there was a treaty of 1858 and 1860, which is practically yesterday in terms of how the Chinese view their history. So all the Russian Far East is part of their historic claim. And certainly, I have a colleague who's from China, and she was saying how every school child in China learns about the territories Russia stole from China. In other words, this is something that the Chinese government inculcates in its population, that Russia is occupying Chinese territory. They're not going to let this go. At some point, they're going to want this back. And I think that the weaker Russia becomes, the more dependent on China it becomes. I think that at some point the issue will be raised that, don't you want to right this historical wrong that, because obviously, your Chinese brothers are helping you so much that you need to do this. And, and I think also it's a logic, well, if Russia claims territory from Ukraine is rightfully belonging to Russia, well, China has rightful claims against Russia as well. And shouldn't we settle all of these things at once? So I think that Putin has his focus on the supposed threat from the West has made him blind to what I think the real threat to Russia actually is.
Professor, what do you think? Do you think that this war will be a long war, and what scenarios are possible?
I'm sorry to say that I think it will be a long war. I think it will be like the Iran-Iraq war, that it could go on. That went on for some 8 years. I'm sorry to say it, but I think that this is a strong possibility that it will grind on, and that the determination will be either Russia collapses or Western support for Ukraine collapses. Ukrainian resistance will never collapse. But I worry about Western support for Ukraine. Just shocking to me that this is even in question. But I think there's a real possibility that we'll see dramatic change in Russia, because certainly for the Russian armed forces, I think that I had an article in The Hill, I think it was in March of last year, sort of making my own recommendation to the Russian military to overthrow Putin, to save not just Russia but itself. In other words, that the longer the war goes on, the more that the Russian armed forces become degraded, and that they risk losing control over their own soldiers. Wouldn't it be better to just get rid of Putin now? And I think we're not going to see democracy immediately in Russia, but I think we'd all settle for a prudent authoritarian regime there. It's someone who just wants to simply rebuild Russia economically, who sees it in Russia's interests to get along with the West, that any and all claims against Ukraine or anyone else are simply foolish. To me, what was interesting is that during the Prigozhin mutiny, Prigozhin himself came out and said that Ukraine posed no threat to Russia. Now, this isn't a dissident. This isn't like a human rights advocate. This is Prigozhin, one of Putin's top lieutenants. That if anything, even fiercer in terms of Russian nationalism, and he comes out and says that Ukraine posed no threat to Russia. I would imagine that if Prigozhin said this, that this idea is widespread within the ranks of the Russian military leadership, that they understand that this war is not in Russia's interests, that they need to pull back, and that the longer it goes on, I think the more problems that Russia, can have. I think at a certain point that the weaker the Russian armed forces become, we're going to see rebellious activity in the North Caucasus. We're going to see, I think, various, disputes within the ranks of the armed forces. That it's going to be harder and harder for Putin to keep control domestically, and in other words, that Ukraine won't necessarily even be his biggest problem after a certain point. That just staying in power will be. He has, but he cannot change. I think that the great historical analogy is to Nicholas I, whom I understand that Putin reveres. That very successful. He. For so many years, he crushed the Decembrists' revolt. He was highly successful against the Ottoman Empire. He crushed Poland, and then he got himself involved in the Crimean War. And then suddenly, Britain and France are helping the Ottoman Empire. And then he can't win, but he can't stop. And that the war only ends after his death, and he's succeeded by Alexander II, who understands that Russia needs to stop this, and at least needs a time period to rebuild. Of course, he attempted all these reforms, which didn't work. And it's a real tragedy. I think that Alexander II didn't last longer. For Russia could have developed into a normal Western country had he lived and signed the Constitution he was on the way to sign. But that's the sad thing about Russia, is that every time it seems to be about to make progress, something horrible happens, and it doesn't. But I think that Putin has gotten himself in the same trap that Nicholas I was, and he himself can't get out of it. Therefore, it will have to be a different Russian leadership.
Professor, you say that you're worried about the Western support for Ukraine. Why you say so?
Well, we see, obviously President Zelensky was just here, and it was very different from his visit in December. That we have Republican politicians in particular who are questioning, why should we continue to support Ukraine? And the argument is that, as we saw with in Poland, is that we need to build up our own forces. We can't afford to give more weapons to Ukraine. But this is just, I think, very foolish thinking, and so I think it also has to do with domestic politics. I think there are Republicans who, they want to portray Biden as weak. That they were very happy when President Biden, following the agreement that President Trump made with the Taliban, was reducing American forces in Europe, and of course the Afghan government fell. Now, to me, there's a huge difference between trying to support a government that, for whatever reason, is incapable of defending itself and its own forces won't defend it, and supporting a government whose armed forces and people are fighting for their own survival. That, I actually think that it was right for the U.S. to withdraw from Afghanistan, and as unfortunate as it is for the people of Afghanistan, that if they're not willing to fight against the Taliban, then I'm not quite sure why the U.S. should do it for them or can do it for them. But it's different with Ukraine. And I think that bothers a lot of Republicans, that Biden's policy toward Ukraine has been so successful. In other words, this is not the narrative that they want, that Democrats are successful in terms of supporting conflict in particular. This is something that only Republicans are supposed to be able to do effectively, at least in terms of how they want to portray it. And so I think that in other words, it's the success of the Biden's of support for Ukraine that bothers a lot of extreme Republicans. Now, I'm not saying all, because certainly there's a lot of Republicans, mainstream Republicans, who are not only very supportive of Ukraine, but think that the U.S. should do even more than the Biden administration has been doing. So I don't want to lump all Republicans, into the same basket. But those who want to reduce support for Ukraine. It has to do a lot with their own domestic agenda, or some of them have the argument that really that the real enemy is China. How can we, this is a diversion, supporting Ukraine, because we have to be ready to fight the Chinese. That's going to be, fiercer. But to me, in my view, that the more successful, if Russia is successful against Ukraine, this is going to embolden China. That the way to deter China is to hold the line in Ukraine, because certainly they're watching what's happening in Ukraine with regard to their own aspirations with regard to Taiwan. That I think that the war in Ukraine has given them pause. In other words, that if they decided to invade Taiwan, maybe it would be another Ukraine, and they don't want that. Now, I've heard people saying that there's a lot of differences, that Ukraine is so much bigger, that Ukraine has borders with countries willing to support it. Taiwan's smaller, that there is no Poland right next to Taiwan, that it's going to be much more difficult, and that Taiwanese armed forces really have not prepared adequately for a serious conflict. But I think certainly that what's happening in Ukraine must give Beijing pause, because I think that they would prefer to be able to that Taiwan just surrender. That would be their ideal situation, because I think that if they go to war in Taiwan and they start experiencing large-scale casualties, then this can cause problems for the Chinese Communist Party at home that they don't want to have. So, I think that if the U.S. doesn't support Ukraine, that they will draw a lesson from that. Well, then will the U.S. actually support Taiwan? Not for long.
And the last question, what do you think, how the results of this Russia's war against Ukraine could influence for the whole geopolitical configuration? Does it matter, the results?
Yeah, it does matter. I mean, this really, I think, is the most important war since World War II. I think that there's nothing short of that. This is, and I think that or maybe sort of a better resemblance is to World War I. I'm not sure, but in other words, it's a major war like that. And I think that there are some who are hoping that Russia and the West will weaken themselves in this war, and therefore this will help countries in the global South, specific countries, gain strength. But I think that I also think getting back to the question of interests and values is that a victorious Ukraine will go far to, I think, advance the cause of democracy, to show how a smaller democratic nation can stand up to a larger authoritarian nation. I think if the war goes the other way, then I think that the prospects for democracy are not good, certainly not for its spreading. And I think that it's I think there's a lot at stake. In other words, that if Russia in some sense prevails, then I think that America's power and influence will be weakened, because who then could count on the United States if Ukraine is not successful? And I think that there will be a tendency, well then, we have to make some kind of deal with Russia, and of course that would be highly counterproductive. But that's the kind of thing that people are interested in, their immediate comfort and security. I also think that I think that what's going to happen is that what is happening in this war is that Russia is just becoming weaker and weaker, and that Russia will be less of a factor in future, and that what we may see is more of a rise of a world dominated by a Chinese American competition, and Russia will be part of that competition. In other words, it'll be competition for influence in Russia, and so and I think that what we'll see is that Putin's successors, some of them may decide that Russia's best interest is to try to maneuver between China and the West. I've heard Russians say that. In other words, that they don't want to be just China's little brother, but that means that they have to get along with the West to some extent in order to be able to maneuver between the West and China, and therefore giving up any and all claims in Ukraine would be in Russia's interests. So I think we're at a real inflection point here with this war. That it'll if I hope it'll result in the diminution of Russian power. If it doesn't, it will result in the diminution of American power. And I think that China, India are looking at this as well. I think we're at a point where not just the continuation of the war in Ukraine, the outcome of the war in Ukraine will have a huge impact on global geopolitics. That people may not understand this or want to focus on this, but that it will be a very different world.
Professor, thank you so much to be with us today.